We used to sit around in the evenings drinking coffee or sometimes something slightly stronger and have lots of spiritual conversations. It was interesting having spiritual conversations between those of us who were Christians and those who weren't. And very often the conversation would turn to demands from those who weren't Christians, demands for proof. Prove it to me that what you say is true is actually true. And I suppose perhaps a reflection on the fact that I was doing a scientific degree, I rather enjoyed those sorts of conversations because I was on fairly solid ground. I felt that there was some significant evidence that what we believe as Christians is true in the sense of being statements that cohere with reality, and we had a good old ding about. I'm not sure that they were ever convinced, but nonetheless it was a good conversation. But reflecting on where our culture has moved since then, that's not, it seems to me, the sort of question that people are asking these days. I think there's been a movement from 30, 40 years ago where people were saying, is it true, prove it to me, towards, does it work? So people want to know, they're not so fussed about whether it's true or not, they want to know whether it makes a difference, does it work? But even now sometimes people ask the question, does it feel good to me? Which is an interesting question because that has actually nothing to do with either truth or efficacy. It's whether it has an emotional resonance with where we are at this particular point in time. And we do live in a culture, don't we, where people will believe 30 mutually contradictory bits of nonsense before breakfast and not see any real problem with it. I mean, just open your Sunday supplements when you go home today, and there's 30 mutually contradictory bits of nonsense in them most weeks, really. So we live in an age now of relative truth. Oh, well, that's true for you, but it's not true for me. We live in a world of alternative facts. It's profoundly disturbing, if ever there was anything. But where these sort of questions of truth are not so important. Now, I still think apologetics, or the practice of giving a reason for the hope that is within us, is incredibly important, because it remains the case, even if people aren't asking the question, it seems to me it does remain the case, it's important that what we believe as Christians is actually true, and not just some subjective construct of our own imagination. And I think that there are some very good, well-reasoned arguments why we would say that the central facts on which we place our trust as Christians are true. There is a significant evidence for the historical Jesus and the things that Jesus did. And in a few weeks' time, despite the fact that probably the BBC will find any number of people who will say the resurrection was a spiritual resurrection or Jesus came alive in their hearts, whatever that nonsense means, I will stand up and proclaim Christ is risen and give some, I hope, very compelling reasons why we believe that is true. And we have some wonderful apologists to help us with that. But the reality is that very few people, if anybody, is converted by intellectual argument. I think what we can do is establish that what we believe as Christians is reasonable, and you don't have to commit intellectual suicide in order to become a Christian. But the thing is that Christian faith is about much more than what we believe in our heads. If Christian faith was just being persuaded of some truths about God, that would be one thing. But we can see, can't we, from the scriptures, that Christian faith is about much more than that. It's about what you do with what you have believed. Faith is about both belief, but it is also about obedience and response. Faith, again, is a slippery word. You hear the word faith used in our culture, and very often what it means is that you believe something with no evidence or in spite of evidence to the contrary. It's detached altogether from truth. Faith, when you read it in the New Testament, means placing your trust, staking your life on something you passionately believe to be true. So it's not a quantity. You know, I've got 15 units of faith and you've got 20 units of faith, and I like a little bit more faith sort of topped up like petrol in your car. It's not that. It is a chosen response to what God has revealed to us about himself. And I suspect that for most of us, at some point in our Christian journey, we will have had some sort of experience of the reality of God that switched our thinking. It may not be some spectacular experience like the sorts of experiences that people have in the Bible, and the Old Testament and the New Testament. It may be something very, very mundane. I mean, for me, I started on the journey of inquiry into faith because I was dragged kicking and screaming against my better judgment to a church youth group by my sister, where as a spotty, foul-mouthed motorcycling oik, I was impressed by the fact that they were really nice to me. Was it really? There was a whole group of people who treated me with love and respect in a way that I had not encountered before, which started me to ask the question, well, hang on, what's going on here with this group of people? Perhaps we need to look into this faith in a little bit more detail. And for many of you, I think most people who come to faith as adults will say that the most important thing in that journey was encountering Jesus in a Christian friend. So those sorts of things are really important, people encountering the reality of Jesus in other people. But of course in the Bible there are some spectacular experiences of the reality of God. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses, and talk of angels and burning bushes and audible voices. And Saul on the road to Damascus, poleaxed by the appearance of Jesus to him, something that he couldn't even speak about in personal terms in the years subsequently. He starts talking the third person in 2 Corinthians. I'll tell you of a man taken up to heaven, granted a vision of things of which it is not permissible to tell. And this experience of the disciples at the Transfiguration is one of those sorts of experiences where the invisible spiritual realm suddenly becomes visible. Jesus' clothes begin to glow like they're radioactive. I don't know, we might say that today. And his face is transformed. And that which we know is true of Jesus, that he is God in human form, almost sort of begins to bleed out of him in a visual way that they can't possibly deny. And alongside him come Moses and Elijah, the symbols of the great pillars of the Jewish faith. Moses symbolizing the law, and Elijah symbolizing the prophets. And this is a revelation that says, this Jesus who you have begun to follow is the one who fulfills and completes everything that was promised thousands of years ago in the Old Testament. This is more than a man. This is indeed God incarnate, and you are seeing that fleshed out before your eyes. But it's not just a revelation, in fact, for the disciples. This is one of the 3 occasions where we see God making himself incredibly real and manifest to Jesus himself. You see that at the baptism when the Spirit descends on him. You see it here, and you see it at Gethsemane. And these last 2 are where God is actually fortifying Jesus for his transition in his ministry from the teaching ministry to the road to Jerusalem and the road to the cross. It's why this reading is set for this Sunday, the Sunday before Lent. It's a pivotal moment in Jesus' ministry where he moves from the teaching to the resolute journey to self-sacrifice that is going to enable us to be forgiven. And these real experiences of God are clearly not meant to be just about the warm fuzzies. The disciples, Peter, James and John, were absolutely terrified. They fell to the ground. They were so scared, same as Paul did on the Damascus road. And they start doing silly things, oh, shall we put a tent up? I mean, perhaps they had a card with go outdoors or something, because they did it in the Acts as well. Oh, let's put a tent up. That seems to be the response when they don't know what to do. I'll put one up for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. They're befuddled by it. I think sometimes our expectation of an experience of God, which we sometimes ask for, is we'll settle at the warm fuzzies, but actually be careful what you wish for. So often these experiences of the reality of God are profound and deep and don't leave you the same. They're not experiences that just give you a warm feeling and then you just carry on life as normal. All of these great experiences of God that you see in the Bible are all experiences that lead to the transformation of life and a new direction. You think of Isaiah confronted with the reality of God in that vision that he had in Isaiah chapter 6. And what does it lead to? It leads to his commission as a prophet. Here am I, Lord, send me. Moses wanted to see the face of God, but God had to hide him in a cleft in the rock because God said to him, if you see my face, you will die. And all he got was a picture of God sort of fading into the distance. And for the disciples, their incredible revelation of the reality of God led them to transformed lives. I'm sure that they needed that level of experience of God to sustain them through what was to come after Jesus' resurrection and ascension and their call to spread the gospel. Peter ends up being crucified upside down. James is killed in the first wave of persecution. John's actually the only apostle who ends up living to a ripe old age. The others are all martyred. They needed actually that sense of, to go through those sorts of challenging experiences, they needed the sustaining, undeniable experience of God's reality that they got both in the Transfiguration and in the witness of Jesus' resurrection. So if you're asking for an experience of the reality of God, that's a good thing to ask for, because actually God, I believe, longs to reveal himself to us. But just be careful what you're asking for, because with great revelation comes great responsibility. If you encounter the reality of God, you can't stay the same. You can't just carry on life as if it just goes on and on and on. God's reality breaking into our reality means that we have to do something about it. We have to respond to it. We have to be obedient. I was talking to someone the other day who just was telling me about that they had asked God for a fresh revelation of himself to them. And they felt the Lord saying to them very clearly, and this was from many years ago when the Iron Curtain was down, do you love me enough to go to Russia? And that person never left the country before, rather timid. They weren't sure about that. The revelation sometimes leads to something that perhaps we weren't anticipating. But I think there's a puzzle, though, isn't there, in this as well? Because one of the questions we often ask, I'm sure, when we're sharing faith with other people, when we're feeling that we need to do the work of an evangelist, is why doesn't God make it any easier for us? Why doesn't the Lord just reveal a little bit more of himself so it's more difficult for people to deny him and carry on in their own sweet way? And this is the question that hangs over this event as well, doesn't it? Because, of course, the disciples don't immediately go down the mountain and tell everybody about it. In fact, they don't start talking about it until after the resurrection. And in fact, very often when Jesus does the amazing things that he does, the works of healing and everything else, what does he say to people? Don't tell anybody. You think, Lord, haven't you been to the marketing department? You know, this is not how we do it, how we spread a movement. If there's spectacular things going on, you tweet it and you send it out on social media. You let everybody know what's going on. That didn't seem to be the way that Jesus operated. Now, of course, in the context of this, Jesus is very, very wary because the expectations that are being placed on him by both the disciples but certainly by the wider community is that when he identifies himself as a Messiah, the chosen one, the one that they're expecting, what they're expecting is someone who is going to be a military leader, who's going to reconstitute the nation, who's going to drive out the Romans and re-establish their national identity. That is not what Jesus came to do. So start talking in those terms would mean that the whole mission was hijacked and distorted. Jesus does admit very, very clearly and unequivocally, certainly towards the end of his life as he's on trial and when it's too late to do anything about it, he's very clear and unequivocal about who he is. People say, oh, Jesus never claimed to be God. Yes, he did. That's precisely what he claimed to do towards the end of his life in the trial and resurrection. But at that point, it was too late for him to be hijacked and tried to be made king and given political responsibility. But perhaps one of the deeply mysterious things about all these things is that Jesus never forces himself on anybody. That's the temptation that he resisted both in the desert and in Gethsemane. It's the reason why he told parables, because faith is not just about being intellectually convinced, it's about acting on what has been revealed to you. The parables leave people who aren't quite ready to respond to the call of faith a certain plausible deniability. That they can say, well, we didn't quite understand it, and therefore not be held responsible for effectively denying Jesus. Because, as we've said, these real experiences of the reality of God are always tied to obedience. Spiritual experiences are to encourage us to be obedient, not to entertain us. And perhaps we need to be aware that in modern spirituality, which is so much about self-actualization and making ourselves feel good, it's not about the transformation of life and transforming and changing the world. Perhaps experiences in our culture can be misunderstood and misinterpreted and hijacked for the wrong purposes. But graciously, the Lord does show himself to us. Sometimes through a still small voice, sometimes through the experience of his presence as we gather together to worship. Sometimes as we go about our daily lives, we just have a sense of his reality. He speaks, he leads us. There's that moment of comfort when we need it, that moment of encouragement when life is very, very confusing. The Lord is there. But these signposts are signposts pointing us in the direction of discipleship, pointing us in the direction of obedience. When we're confronted with the reality of who God is, we can't remain the same ourselves. This is a wonderful, wonderful story of God revealing himself to three people when they needed it most. And be careful what you wish for in terms of praying for the Lord to reveal himself. But it's not wrong to pray that when we need his help, when we need his presence, when we need to know what to do, to pray, Lord, would you reveal yourself to us, is a perfectly fine prayer for us to offer. Amen.